Otherwise, I'll just go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, if you see me like freezing or disappearing, just continue.
Yeah, will do.
Okay. So we are streaming to LinkedIn and YouTube simultaneously. Let me see. All right, I'm trying to see if anyone has joined us. All right, so we'll just wait about 2 more minutes, 5 minutes in, and then we'll start shooting off questions. Those who are online with us already, welcome. Just say hi in the comments and we'll know you're with us. Let's see. Yeah, something seriously wrong with my connection because I can't even open LinkedIn. I'm starting to think it's this laptop. It's not even my internet.
Got it. Let's hope it works out.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I'm this close to blaming my Windows because this is a Windows laptop. I never had these issues when I had my Mac.
It's interesting. It's the other way around for me. I have some larger issues with my Mac, but on Windows it all works out.
You're a product designer, right?
Yeah, I am a product designer. But I used to, I started in agencies. So
and
it kind of came from a graphic design background.
You on the design side.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, this makes no sense. Okay, I think we'll get started. Thanks, Jan. So I'm suppose I pronounce your name Jan 6.
Right? Yeah, that's correct.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us, Jan. So for all those who are here, we're here with Jan 6. He is the Figma Tokens, a Figma plugin that over 30,000 people have downloaded and installed. So it's being used by quite a number of teams around the world, my team included. And what we wanted to talk about is all things design tokens related and how teams can leverage design tokens within their design systems to make some magic happen. If you Google Jan, you'll find quite a number of talks he's done around design systems, automation, collaboration. I really, really encourage you to go through those because those are really amazing. So Jan, tell us a little bit about the work you're doing at GitHub.
Yeah, so my name is Jan. I am a product designer. I'm based in Austria, so it's end of day for me soon. And I currently work for GitHub, where I am working as a staff product designer. But my design background kind of came from agencies. So I worked in design agencies for a long time, which is where I started, like as a mix between a print and the web designer. That was now 15 years ago or so. So I collected a couple of years experience in that environment, having to do a lot of redesigns for websites, doing the same thing over and over again, restyled for a different client kind of. So that's kind of what happened to working in agencies, which also kind of led to the work I did later on with Figma Tokens, I guess. But yeah, that's about me.
So how did you make the switch from graphic design to product design? Because one is very kind of traditional and the other is more focused on. So how did you make that switch to product?
I think that the switch kind of happened over time. So as I kind of worked in these agencies, I more and more worked on web projects, and I kind of really discovered that I liked that part of that kind of process. And I guess at some point I just didn't like working in print anymore, and I only took on screen design jobs, how we called it back then. And I just discovered that over time, and that's then something that I wanted to work on further. One thing that I always disliked about working in agencies was that, at least the agencies I worked in, was more about you work on a project, and once it's done, it's kind of not your business anymore. You kind of hand it over. And that's the part that I didn't really like. I kind of like to work on something and optimize that over time, which is, I think, something we can do in product design quite well. So we can look at a product, see how it evolves, see what works, see what doesn't. That's the stuff I wanted to do, and that's kind of when I knew that I needed to do a change, which I then just did and jumped over to a startup that was working in. It was a smaller startup, but I was there as a product designer, and I also got into code a bit because it's due to the nature of it being very small. You get to touch on a lot of things, which really helped to dive into code more.
So you're self-taught when it comes to code?
I am pretty much, yes. We had something like that in university, but it didn't go into the depths of it because it was a design course. But I learned to code quite early on. I never really saw it as my proficiency or so. I always liked to do it on the side. And I guess that's just when it evolved.
That's amazing. So it's actually a great segue into one of my first questions, which is, do you feel like it's a good thing for designers to learn how to code? Is that something you would recommend?
I feel definitely, like, especially if you're working on anything that has to do with code, like your designs are being executed by someone, somebody has to build them, and your customers are experiencing them as code, at least in a way. So having some kind of an understanding of how things are built and how things work under the hood helps incredibly by, first of all, getting an understanding what is possible, but also it allows you to build your own prototypes and build your own ideas. So instead of being reliant on an engineer to build the ideas that you might have, I feel it's way faster to get to some kind of a feedback that is closer to the real thing if you're just building out a prototype on your own. So jumping into code to build some interaction is something I always prefer to doing that in Figma, even though it might be faster in Figma, but it doesn't feel as real as if you were building that prototype on your own. So that's something I value to do quite early on in the product or in the project.
So I know like a lot of designers find code very intimidating. So say is the best place to start when it comes to like a language that's easy to understand syntax wise? Would you say like it's like HTML, CSS? I suppose that's like the easiest place for designers to start.
Yeah, I feel that is a great place to start, because you get this immediate feedback on, you can just inspect the web page and make some changes, and you can see it adapt to whatever it is you changed. It doesn't require any of the interactive things you might build on top of it. Like, you can do so much with just HTML and CSS when it comes to a prototype. And I feel like JavaScript as an add-on to all that is kind of a natural extension to being able to build these interactive experiences, but just being able to lay out the design on itself without moving things around with interactivity helps a lot to get into all that. And that's one thing that has always worked for me too, even when I didn't officially code or so in my job back then, to dive into designs and give engineers feedback on how it should look like. And at some point, I guess I just realized I could just do it myself without having to have somebody who just then does these changes. And I feel that's a skill that comes a long way. Like, if you're able to work with your engineers towards something, you are taking work off their plate, which is something that every engineer, I think, will value. So that skill is something that definitely helps you if you're in any way collaborating with any engineer.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm actually thinking now, because I watched your a presentation you did at I think the Figma thing about 5 months ago, and you're showing that automation with GitHub as your source of truth in the middle. And in that entire workflow, the way Figma Tokens and GitHub work together made it actually seem like designers don't actually need to learn how to code anymore. Because a lot of the things they can do in Figma can now be automated and translated into code without them having to necessarily understand, how the button is actually built in HTML or CSS. They just have to worry about being domain experts in Figma. And because everything is linked all the way through to VS Code in the developer's environment, then that makes the designer's job and the handoff much, much easier. So would you say the work you're doing at Figma Tokens and just how design and development and product are maturing, it's coming to a stage where designers actually don't need to learn how to code, because all of it in the middle, all the work in the middle is being handled?
I think at some point that's definitely true, because as tools evolve and get closer to code, maybe even the design tools itself, there might be less of a need to actually perform that work. But I still feel it provides a very solid basis to have this understanding of how things are structured, which is useful even when you are just changing these design decisions on their own.
Right.
But I feel like those decisions still need to be kind of built at some point. So this initial step of building that experience still requires someone to do that job of translating design to code. But I could definitely see a tool in the future that is closer to code. And we already see that with tools like, there has been a lot of design tools in the past that came out in that regard, like Plasmic or Modules, which was discontinued, and many others which are closer to code. So they kind of limit what you can do as a designer in the way of free-form design. But as they are so close to code, you could just treat it like building with Lego. So you would just inject your components and then shuffle them around until it makes a nice layout or so, and call it a day. And you would get something out of that, which is perfectly valid code, because it's just these Lego components that you have there. And as designers, we wouldn't even have to touch any kind of HTML there. If that's our job, then that's about it. But having this understanding of the difference between freeform design and the box model of the web goes a very long way.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Now, I'm in that same camp for two reasons. So the first reason is product designers or designers that work within digital are some of the only designers where they don't need to understand the underlying technology or the underlying practice that's actually building what they're designing. Right? If you look at architects, for instance, that design buildings, they need to have an understanding of how buildings are built, because otherwise they would design, impractical buildings. Same thing with actual physical product designers. For example, the guys that design Apple hardware, they need to have an understanding of that, how that hardware is tooled and manufactured. Even people that design cars, they need to understand the ergonomics and the actual process that goes behind making the cars to make something that's functional and practical. Whereas if you look at designers in our space, like we're saying now, a lot of them don't know how to code, which is weird, because then how are you going to design the best experiences if you don't know how those experiences are built? And the other reason is, actually, I forget the other reason, but that's the main reason. Design tokens, let's talk about that, because like I was saying to you before we went live, it really did fundamentally change the way my teams work. So tell us about what made you come up with the idea of the plugin.
I think the main idea for working on something like that. So I heard about design tokens maybe a year before I started work on the plugin or so, or I guess sometime before that. And that all sounded really awesome. So you have this kind of this glue that ties everything together, to have this bridge between design and code, and to have this way to codify your design decisions. But at the same time, there was no good way to really use it as a designer. All the tools that were out there were really for engineers. So you'd have these transformation tools that do a lot of the job of transforming this JSON to transform these design tokens to a CSS file, for example. But there was no tool available that really let you use that in design. And given I have worked in some agencies before, and the startup that I was telling you about earlier, where I kind of started product design, was also more of a white label kind of solution. So you'd have multiple brands, but it all contained the same core components under the hood. So restyling these as you go. So I was the only designer in that startup, and there were a lot of engineers, and I had to do a lot of work. And given we had to really build multiple experiences for multiple brands, but I was so time constrained, I saw the need for it, and I tried to implement that more and more. But I guess at some point I always wanted to wait for Figma to implement it, because I felt that you'd have to have something native to make use of it.
Right.
Because you can apply styles in a perfect manner, you can apply typography styles, color styles, and so on. And I didn't want anything that kind of threw me out of that workflow. But at the same time, not having it cost me so much time that at some point I just said, well, screw it, I'm going to try to make it work, and at least try to build something that attempts to build it into our workflows, because then we as designers would have something that we could use in that area. And I feel if a technology like that is to take off, having designers on board is going to be very important for all this, because it is basically for designers, but yet engineers were the ones that really took a profit out of that. So I have seen this blog post by Abdul, who I think is used to be Dubai bound, but I think he's now in Helsinki, who's had this blog post out to implement design tokens in Figma itself. And then when I kind of decided to work on it, I contacted him to work on this very first version together, which was now, I think, more than 2.5 years ago. And the plugin has since really evolved. So it was this constant side project of mine that kept me kind of working on it at nights. If you look at the very first version, it's very basic, but it evolved to something that is usable later on.
Amazing. And in terms of your roadmap for design token, actually, before we get to that, you mentioned native Figma support. Why do you think Figma hasn't done it yet?
I think it is a very complex topic to get right without overcomplicating the tool itself. Like Figma Tokens is a very complex tool, and onboarding is very hard to do. So the whole concept of tokens is so new and so complex that I feel adding it to Figma would really make things more complex, which I guess is one of the reasons for Figma to kind of hold off with that feature until they get it right, and I'm sure they will. And I guess like even if they implement design tokens, they are probably not going to go into all the depth that they could go into. Like the plugin right now is it is that popular because it allows you to create these complex multi-brand scenarios, and that would be very hard in a simple way, which you would require if you want to appeal for the mass market. And one thing that we might forget from time to time is that design tokens is for a very, very specialized group of users. So anyone who's working in design systems probably heard about them, but then not every designer who's working in Figma even works in design systems. So it's for a very specific subset of users, which I guess makes it not as appealing for a big company such as Figma to tackle that early on.
It's interesting you say that, because I actually find that it would benefit any designer to actually use and understand tokens. Because like I was telling you before we started, the way I set up my team to work is we don't use Figma styles anymore at all. We purely only use Figma tokens, because then you can create much more scalable journeys and flows within Figma doing that, right? Like you said, doing the theme switching with light mode and dark mode is much more straightforward when you do it with Figma tokens. If you're doing it with any of native styles, whether it's typography or color, it becomes a mammoth task. So I would actually argue that understanding design tokens is critical for any designer, especially when you're now doing design reviews with the developers, which we typically do like once every sprint. If you're looking at what the developers built on the screen just at face value, it might look correct. But what I recommend my team to do is actually ask them to open their development environment and look at the code instead of just looking at the output. Because then you can actually see, wait a minute, when you applied this text, you didn't use the design token for it. So it's not going to work for dark mode, or it's not the standard that we agreed upon, etc. So I feel like it's another way. Again, if you're talking about learning how to code, it's on top of that, it's another way, just a way for designers to sing into code, because these are all the standards that they've decided as a design team. So all the designers know, if I use development speak and call them variables, all our designers can recognize the development variables because same as our design tokens. So I feel like there's a lot of benefit for designers, any designer besides the design system team, actually learn and start using tokens.
I agree, definitely. Maybe the focus for the Figma Tokens plugin has for a long time been this ability for you to manage your design tokens and to have that as something that is very close to code, how it's stored, but also all these references. And we have so many complex features such as math and other variations of tokens that you can create. I feel the way that Figma implemented styles and how they kept it close to code variables when you are looking at it from an inspect panel is what is already kind of close to a design token methodology, but without the underlying technology, so to say. So that kind of brings me back to this thing before, where I for a long time thought it has to be native for it to be useful. And it's not that far off. Like they had their style system. It's just that there weren't any references inside of them to really create these things that engineers have been able to do for a long time, to create this nested design system that doesn't require you to change every style, but you just have to change the core tokens basically. And
Yes.
I feel if that is in, then that is definitely something that every designer should know about. I agree.
Right.
But there's so many parts of the plugin right now which are very specific to the maintainer of a design system that I feel it's often very complex for anyone to get started there. But if we are able to break that down to the core meaning of what it means to have this semantic system built, then totally that is something that everyone should benefit from.
For sure. And another interesting development is the WTC community group that's working on the design token standard. So can you tell us a little bit about what that is, and how do you feel, like what impact will it have when it comes to design tokens, and how does that then translate into being supported in Figma Tokens plugin?
So basically what the W3C design tokens community group is it's a shared, it's a group of people who are working towards this format for design tokens, which I think will really change the way how we work between these tools. So I kind of see it as, once it's out there, a design token could be the glue that keeps tools together. You would be able to, like, that is one aspect of it. You could take your design decisions that you create in Figma to some other tool that you might want to go to, or you could keep the same design decisions and export them to something like a print tool such as InDesign or so. But you wouldn't have to recreate these once the tools have the proper support for that format. Because for a long time it was built in a way where each tool had their own standard. Everyone was working on their own thing, but then there was no good way to take your styles, your colors, your typography, your everything to another tool and to another workflow. And with that standard, I feel this is changing. So it's this common standard that is coming, where we kind of define how we as a group of designers work, or define our design decisions. And that is very relevant, especially now when after the Adobe acquisition of Figma. That is something that I think a lot of people reminded them about, that we will probably not live in one design tool for the rest of time. So we will always have to switch between tools. And having a way to store our design decisions that make up our brand or our products outside of that tool is very relevant, given these kind of evolutions. So having a way to move all that with the click of a button sounds very appealing if it is if a new tool comes around or so. As of now, the Figma Tokens plugin doesn't exactly mirror that new format that is coming, but we are working towards that. So that was also something that was evolving over time. This format, it's currently in a draft stage, so it's settled a bit more now. So we are working towards bringing that in, because otherwise it would be a breaking change every few months or so. But now that it's getting closer to a release, we feel confident that we can implement that. And that would mean that the tokens that you create in Figma is something that you could take elsewhere and take to another tool. But the other benefit that I was showing at Figma Config last year, I don't know, earlier, a couple of months ago, where you are able to store these tokens on the source of truth, which would be a code repository such as GitHub. You could then write some automations, some transformations, which would take your your tokens file into a CSS file or into an SCSS file, all automatically. Because it's the standard way of how we write things, tools can take that and transform it elsewhere. We wouldn't have to recreate so many tools because somebody wrote it a little bit different. If everything is stored in this one standard, there will be so many tools evolving where we probably don't even know yet what is all possible, for how many automations can happen. But writing some of these design decisions in custom files is probably a thing of the past, especially once we have some visual way of how you can define them or get them out of Figma into this code environment. So yeah, we are working towards bringing that standard, that format into the Figma Tokens plugin. I don't have any ETA yet on that, but it's one of our next things that we want to tackle. And then
I was actually wondering if you're part of that community group. It sounds like you are.
Yeah, we are part of that group, but we're not part of the editors. So there's a distinction between being part of the editors who write the draft and being in the larger group.
Got it. Amazing. Cool. And you spoke about code being the optimal source of truth for a design system. So can you talk about how teams can get started? So how can teams get started with moving to a place where all eyes are on the code, not necessarily the documentation they're writing in Figma? Like, how do you think is the best way for teams to get started and having that conversation with their development teams?
I feel that a lot of teams probably already store their design decisions in code, given like every product is maybe built on a website. So you'd have something like CSS files storing these design decisions in the way we store them for the web, like SCSS, CSS, or SAS, or any of these. But then if any change happens, it's always up to the engineer to perform that change, except if a designer is comfortable in code and goes in and changes that directly in that CSS file or in these 7 files maybe that require some change. But that is all very manual. And if there's no designer that is comfortable doing these changes, it's usually up to engineers, which is something that, like, the time of an engineer is probably very, very scarce. So
yeah, it is.
Anything that you can help there to reduce that is good. Maybe a good first step would be to establish this kind of automation that transforms your design decisions stored in this tokens compatible format to the CSS variant, like to have something of a smaller prototype, which you can work on with your engineering partners. I feel it's something where you have to still convince your engineering partners to get in, but once they see the benefit and the value that they will get out of that over time, it's usually a reason to get buy-in for that, especially given like dark mode, light mode. Like having to build all that from scratch takes a lot of time. But if you're able to work on a system that allows the designer to make most of these changes, you're actually saving time for your whole team. So that, I feel, is a great argument for that. But it's complex to get started. That's totally true. And oftentimes designers don't have the knowledge to build these kind of prototypes, to build these proofs of concept. So having some engineering partner around is definitely useful. I would totally also, when starting that process, have somebody from engineering be in that team that is kind of working on that, just to get everyone of the team on board with that. When it comes to naming things, when it comes to how we set things up, it's very important to break down these silos and work on this as a team, as it's something that really benefits both parties.
Yeah, amazing. That makes total sense. And so what's on the roadmap for Figma Tokens? Do you still have some features you'd love to put in there that you're planning to work on? What can we look forward to?
So we do have quite an ambitious roadmap. We have a lot of issues on our GitHub repo, so we are open source. And a lot of these are really great ideas that we kind of know that would be awesome to get in, but it's just a matter of time when we will actually get to them. One of the things that I'm really looking forward to is color modifiers, so that you could have, you could basically have a base color such as a blue, and you would then define, I want to transform this color and lighten that by 10% or darken that by 10%. By having this in place, you would effectively create these dynamic colors, which you could create 200 colors which are slight variations just by changing this base color. And that should save, again, a lot of time recreating all these themes and all these palettes of colors. We have that in code since a long time with the use of these color tools. But in design, we didn't really have that for the longest time. But at the same time, this is something that really takes up a lot of our jobs when we are creating new themes, right? We have to create these variations of colors when we do dark mode or when we do a rebrand to something else. So that is something that I think is going to be really good. We are also working on asset tokens, which by definition aren't really part of the format, but something like that, like a string, is part of the design token format. But that would really allow you to go one level deeper when you do multi-brand design. So oftentimes you have images that are different from brand A to brand B, but right now there was no good way to transform them between different themes. And that should open up that possibility of, for example, changing a logo if that logo is a PNG or something, or changing like certain images across the site that you want to have changed with your tokens. And then there's many new token types. Yeah, for example, exactly.
Yeah, like
that would be another one.
Logos. Yeah.
Yeah. And also many images itself kind of require a different treatment when in light mode or dark mode. So having something of an optimized experience there.
So what would the input be for that? Like SVG code or URL to that image on your computer? What does that actually look like in practice as a string?
So what we are starting with is just like a URL that lies on your server. We kind of follow the practice of getting something out there, getting feedback, and then optimizing that instead of building the whole suite without knowing what of the experience kind of matters the most. So we want to get something out there that really brings the most value, which is this URL that users could point towards something on their own server.
Wow, that's cool. That's very cool. Especially like because when I was first worked as design system lead at the Emirates MBD Bank, they were using Sitecore as a CMS. So all the designs we would do, like if we had illustrations on a screen, for example, the developers would export that, upload it on the CMS, and then link that to their code. So I'm actually thinking if you can just supply a URL, then that helps that entire process, because then you're just linking to the CMS, and any subsequent change that happens on the CMS could actually end up reflecting in Figma tokens and in Figma as well. That would be amazing, because the whole idea of the CMS was the marketing team and the business team could change images and graphics and illustrations easier without requiring design and development to do it. So if that could, like we're saying, single source of truth, if that could filter through everywhere, that would be amazing.
Right. I think so too. That would be really good to have, because ultimately what you get with tokens is everyone can really work in their own domain. So we have this one source of truth for any design decision, but an engineer doesn't have to open Figma to change that. A designer doesn't have to open VS Code to change that. They could do it inside Figma. The engineer could do it in VS Code. And then you might have this third segment, which are content managers who are maybe creating these images that you are using in your website. So if there is something new coming in, they wouldn't have to open Figma. They wouldn't have to open VS Code. They could just point to that URL that is that image. And then everyone is working on their own islands, but we are all working as one team then, which I think opens up a lot of possibilities. And it would even go one step further if you have content editors who are writing content for you. If that is also part of that source of truth, that would be even more powerful.
Amazing. So we're not getting comments and questions through. I'm not sure what's happening today with the restream. But if people mind, just write a message, just say hi, so we know comments and questions are working. But cool. Thanks, Jan. So those were the questions I had. If there are any follow-up questions, you guys can DM me and I will send them over to Jan. But I would just like to say thanks so much. Is there anything else you wanted to just say before we log off?
No, just wanted to thank you for the invitation, and I think it's awesome that you are doing this in this public space. It's really cool. Thanks.
Amazing. Thanks, Jan. We'll be keeping an eye on Figma Tokens. And yeah,
Awesome.
Thanks so much again for doing this. And have a good weekend. Have a good evening. Thanks so much. Thanks, guys. See you later.
Thank you. You too.
Cheers.